Just before dawn, the Lake Chad Basin exploded. Not in the way Nigerians have come to expect. Not villages burning, not civilians running, not another headline about terror. This was different. Nearly 200 fighters, armed, trained, battle-hardened, were dead by sunrise. Bodies left where they fell, boats still burning on the water, weapons scattered across islands that don't appear on most maps. But here's what made this violence unlike anything we've seen in years. They weren't fighting the military. They weren't attacking communities. They were killing each other. Boko Haram and ISWAP, two factions that have terrorized the Northeast for over a decade, turned their guns inward, and the Lake Chad Basin became a graveyard for the insurgency itself. This wasn't strength. This was collapse. Something fundamental just broke, and what's coming next may be more dangerous than what came before. If you want to understand what's really happening in Nigeria's security landscape, not the headlines, but the forces underneath, subscribe now. This channel exists for Nigerians who refuse to be satisfied with surface-level reporting, people who ask harder questions, people who want the full picture. Hit that like button if you're still here. Drop a comment if this story matters to you, because what happened on Lake Chad wasn't just a battle, it was a signal, and the questions it raises are the ones nobody in Abuja wants to answer. Why now? Why each other? And who benefits when enemies destroy themselves? We're going to break this down, all of it. Stay close. For years, both groups have wrapped themselves in religious language, divine mission, caliphate, purity, righteousness. Strip all that away, and you find something older, something simpler: economics. The Lake Chad Basin isn't just water and reeds, it's a commercial artery. Dried fish moves through it, smuggled fuel crosses borders here, cattle routes run along its edges. People, traders, fishermen, families, paid to move through corridors controlled by armed groups. This is taxation without a state. And for a long time, there was enough to go around. But pressure changes everything. Over the past year, joint military operations intensified. Nigerian forces, working with Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, began squeezing routes that had been open for years. Air surveillance increased, intelligence improved, middlemen disappeared, supply lines fractured. When profits shrink, alliances crack. What started as tension over a single trade corridor near the northern edge of the lake became something bigger. Accusations flew. Commanders accused rivals of cutting secret deals with security forces. Old betrayals resurfaced. Trust evaporated. And then someone gave an order. We still don't know who fired first. That detail remains buried in the chaos. But we know this: the battle that followed wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. Fighters moved into position at night. Supply boats stopped running days before. Local traders who usually paid passage fees were suddenly turned away, not by one group, but by two, each claiming the same water. Overlap became conflict. Conflict became war. By the time fishermen heard the gunfire rolling across the lake, it was already too late to stop it. This wasn't a skirmish. It was sustained, organized, brutal. The kind of fighting that happens when trained forces meet trained forces. And when the sun came up, the lake carried debris, torn uniforms, damaged engines, bodies nobody could retrieve. Nearly 200 dead. But that number is only part of the story, because in the days that followed, something even more revealing happened. Nothing. No victory statement, no consolidation, no clear winner. Just silence. And in that silence, military intelligence began intercepting fragmented radio chatter, desperate requests for ammunition, calls for medical supplies, fighters asking for extraction from positions they could no longer hold. This wasn't the sound of a faction gaining strength.
This was the sound of a structure collapsing from within.
While analysts focused on casualty counts, communities around Lake Chad braced for what usually comes next: retaliation. In Kukawa, Marte, and parts of Abadam local government area, local leaders quietly passed warnings: avoid certain waterways, close markets early, keep children home from school. Not because of immediate attacks, because no one knew what fractured, desperate fighters would do next. Nigerians living in these areas have learned to read violence like weather. They know the patterns. They know that when armed groups turn on each other, civilians often pay the price. Villages accused of backing the wrong side, fishermen punished for trading with rivals, families forced to flee overnight with nothing but what they can carry. The silence after this battle was more frightening than the gunfire, because silence means uncertainty, and uncertainty means danger. Women who sell fish in border markets stayed home. Men who normally paddle out before dawn kept their boats tied. Schools that had only recently reopened suspended classes again, not officially, just quietly. This is the civilian shadow of conflict, the part that doesn't make headlines, the waiting, the watching, the exhausting effort of trying to survive in a place where the rules change without warning. And the violence doesn't respect borders. Lake Chad stretches across Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Islands shift with the seasons. Channels that exist in the wet months disappear in the dry. The waterways ignore the lines drawn on maps, which means instability travels. Fighters fleeing from one side of the lake can appear on the other within hours. A battle that starts in Nigerian territory can send ripples into Chad by nightfall. Refugees who cross looking for safety can find themselves in a country with even fewer resources to help them. Regional security planners are watching this moment carefully because history shows that when armed groups fracture under pressure, three things often follow: defections, intelligence leaks, leadership assassinations. Already, patrols have increased along border corridors. Surveillance flights are monitoring parts of the lake previously considered too dangerous to watch closely. Intelligence sharing between Nigerian and regional forces has intensified. This is not celebration. This is calculation. Because while internal war weakens groups, it can also produce something worse: a smaller, angrier, more ruthless faction determined to reassert dominance. Fighters with nothing left to lose, commanders willing to do anything to prove they still have power. So here's the question Nigerians are asking, and it's a fair one. If nearly 200 fighters can be lost in a single night, how many remain? And more importantly, what kind of violence are they capable of now that desperation has set in? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't theoretical. This is happening in real time, and the answers matter.
Let's be clear about something. There are no heroes in this story. Not the factions tearing each other apart, not the commanders who ordered fighters into a battle that solved nothing, not the networks that profited from fear and control for over a decade. This wasn't a clash of ideologies. This was a turf war dressed in religious language. And while it's tempting to see internal collapse as progress, we need to be honest about what we're witnessing. These groups didn't weaken because they suddenly found morality. They weakened because military pressure, economic strain, and their own greed made cooperation impossible. That's not justice, that's entropy. The truth is this: for years, both factions operated as organized criminal enterprises. They taxed communities, they controlled trade, they exploited fear. And when the pressure mounted, they turned on each other, not out of principle, but out of survival. There's no moral victory in watching criminals fight criminals, but there is a lesson. Power built on violence and exploitation is always unstable. It fractures, it betrays itself, it eats its own. And that matters because it reminds us of something we can't afford to forget. These groups are not invincible. They are not ideological monoliths. They are fragile coalitions held together by fear, profit, and the absence of alternatives. When those things disappear, so does the structure. Now think about this for a moment. If internal pressure can do this much damage, what happens when external pressure continues? What happens when communities stop cooperating out of fear? What happens when fighters realize there's no future in a collapsing enterprise? The answer isn't automatic peace, but it is a shift in momentum, and momentum matters in conflicts like this. This is where you, watching this right now, make a choice. You can scroll past this story and forget it by tomorrow, or you can recognize that understanding these dynamics, really understanding them, is part of the work of rebuilding Nigeria's security. Not through slogans, through truth.
So what happens next? The honest answer is, we don't know. But we can see the possibilities forming. One future is continued collapse, more defections, more intelligence leaks, more fighters surrendering quietly or disappearing into communities, trying to blend back into civilian life. In this version, the insurgency doesn't end with a final battle. It fades through fracture, exhaustion, and irrelevance. Another future is consolidation. A ruthless commander emerges from the chaos. Survivors regroup. The weakest are purged. What's left is smaller, yes, but also harder, more desperate, more willing to prove it still exists through spectacular violence. A third future is retaliation. Fractured groups unable to fight each other effectively turn their anger outward. Civilians become targets again. Communities that survived the battle become collateral in the aftermath. All three futures are possible, and that's what makes this moment so dangerous, because pressure works, but only if it's sustained, only if regional forces maintain coordination, only if intelligence continues to flow, only if communities feel safe enough to stop cooperating with armed groups out of fear. The moment we assume this fight is over, it isn't. History is littered with insurgencies that seemed defeated, only to return because the conditions that created them never changed, because pressure lifted too soon, because attention moved elsewhere. Nigeria can't afford that mistake, not after more than a decade of displacement, trauma, and loss, not after the sacrifices made by soldiers, civilians, and communities who refuse to give up. Not when we're this close to breaking the back of networks that have terrorized the Northeast for far too long. So if you've watched this far, I want you to understand something. This channel doesn't exist to entertain you. It exists to inform you, to equip you, to make sure that when the next headline drops, you're not caught off guard, you're not confused, you're not relying on surface-level takes from people who don't understand the region, the history, or the stakes. Subscribing isn't just about YouTube metrics. It's about choosing to stay informed. It's about refusing to let critical stories disappear into the noise. It's about being part of a community that believes Nigeria deserves better than headlines and hot takes. So subscribe, like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment, because your perspective matters. The Lake Chad Basin is quiet right now, but it's the kind of quiet that makes people who live there nervous, the kind that comes before something shifts, the kind where everyone is waiting to see what breaks next. And when it does, you'll hear about it here first, not from rumors, not from propaganda, from the truth.